How China Forged the Middle Kingdom, from Shang to Han, documentary. From the embers of forgotten villages and the rumors of river-carved valleys, a civilization was formed. Fragile at first, but destined to become one of the most enduring powers the world has ever known. Long before China became China, long before emperors raised palaces of jade, the land was a mosaic of scattered clans, ritual fires, and ancestral fear. Yet within this early chaos, something extraordinary was stirring, the forging of the Middle Kingdom. This is the story of how a people carved order out of disorder, how kings rose and fell like passing storms, and how entire dynasties of Shang, Zhou, Qin, and Han hammered China into its first great imperial form. It is a saga built on bronze and blood, on heavenly mandates and ruthless ambition, on philosophers who wanted harmony and rulers who chased immortality. From the oracle bone rituals of the Shang to the iron-willed unification of Qin Shi Huang, from the flowering brilliance of Zhou philosophy to the golden might of the Han Empire, this journey follows the centuries when China was forged. Welcome to the forging of the Middle Kingdom. The rivers that would not be tamed. Long before China carried the weight of empires and dynasties, its earliest stories began humbly, scattered across a land dominated by rivers. The majority of humanity's first footprints in this region clustered along two colossal watercourses, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. These rivers did not simply provide water, they shaped entire worlds. Their courses determined where people could build homes, plant food, or even dare to dream of survival. Here, on the wide, silty floodplains, men and women settled into a rhythm that revolved around agriculture for the land that held the promise of life. Families learned to harvest the bounty of their environment, dedicating their days to cultivating millet in the dry northern soils and rice in the warm, wet paddies of the south. Over time, entire communities grew out of this delicate union with the earth, each settlement expanding like a breath drawn in hope. Yet their hope was perpetually fragile. Although the soil was rich and the climate cooperative enough to sustain crops, a single unrelenting threat overshadowed every season, the Yellow River itself. Known later as China's sorrow, its temper was legendary. With little warning, it could swell into a monstrous surge, tearing through villages with terrifying force. Floodwaters rushed forward like armies, capable of uprooting homes crafted with patience and care, sweeping away the year's harvest in minutes and leaving death where life had once taken root. Families who had labored for generations could be forced to flee overnight, their livelihoods erased as though they had never existed. To these settlers, the land felt as though it were testing their resilience with calculated cruelty. The rivers giveth, the rivers taketh, but it often seemed the balance tipped toward devastation. Every new settlement felt like a gamble against nature's wrath. It was in this climate of danger and desperation that a figure emerged, one who would later be wrapped in both legend and myth, Yu the engineer. The burden placed upon him was colossal. He was tasked with a near impossible duty to control the flow of the rivers that had tormented generations. For the fledgling communities struggling to survive, Yu represented their last hope of securing a future no longer haunted by floods. Yu did not approach this responsibility lightly. He had seen the river's fury not through stories, but through personal tragedy. His father, Gun, had once attempted to tame these same wild waters, leading earlier attempts to defend the settlements with towering dikes and dams. For 10 long years, Gun and his men poured sweat and lifeblood into building massive walls meant to contain the river's rage. But each time the structures rose, the Yellow River rose higher. No matter how broad the dikes or how thick the dams, the river shattered their efforts with almost deliberate malice. Gun's defeat was the kind of failure that could crush an entire lineage, yet Yu refused to inherit despair. Instead, he inherited the mission. Unafraid of the shadow his father's failures cast, Yu stepped forward with determination that bordered on fearlessness. He understood that the river did not yield to brute force, it had humbled everyone who tried. So Yu changed the strategy entirely. He sought partnership rather than confrontation. To accomplish this, Yu joined forces with a semi-mythical figure in early Chinese lore, Hu Yi, remembered here not as the celestial archer of popular stories, but as a visionary agricultural expert credited with introducing millet to the earliest farmers. Together, Yu and Hu Yi studied the rivers as if they were living beings. They observed the terrain, traced water patterns, and considered what countless men before them had overlooked, that the key was not to fight the river, but to guide it. Their long nights of planning and debating culminated in a groundbreaking idea: a complex canal-based system that would redirect floodwaters safely toward the sea. These channels would not only drain away dangerous excess water, preventing destruction, but also retain part of the flow, storing it for irrigation during times of scarcity. It was a design born from observation, ingenuity, and a deep respect for nature's rhythms. When the system was finally built and set into motion, the effect was staggering. The catastrophic floods that had tormented the region for generations began to ease. Riverbanks held, fields flourished, villages remained standing year after year. For the first time, people could sleep without listening to the rising sound of water in the night. Yu had done the impossible, and the people knew it. In recognition of his triumph, Yu the engineer became Yu the Great, elevated not through conquest but through salvation. His achievement was so profound that the people entrusted him with the highest authority they could conceive, the right to rule. And so, from his success was born the first dynasty recorded in Chinese tradition, the Xia dynasty, the spark that ignited China's millennia-long cycle of dynastic rule. Under Yu's leadership, the Xia lands prospered. Though primarily agricultural, the society made early advancements credited to Xia ingenuity, including improved stone farming tools and the development of a lunar calendar that aligned their agricultural cycles with the movements of the heavens. As the population grew, Yu divided the territory into 9 provinces, each ruled by local lords who owed unwavering loyalty to his authority. With this system, the groundwork for centralized rule in China was laid, but Yu, like the rivers he once tamed, could not defy time. After decades of stabilizing the land, quelling neighboring tribes, and shaping the identity of a nation that barely understood its future greatness, age closed in around him. Death, long held at bay by duty, now approached with quiet insistence. However, Yu did not wish for his son Qi to succeed him. Instead, he chose his trusted minister of justice, Gao Yao, believing he possessed the virtue and wisdom to guide the realm. But shortly after, Gao Yao died. With his first choice gone, Yu selected a tribal leader named Yi to take up the mantle. But the lords of the provinces, deeply loyal to Yu and equally loyal to the old ways of familial honor, refused to accept this. They demanded that Qi inherit the throne, and ultimately their insistence prevailed. Thus, Qi became China's first hereditary ruler, ascending not through merit or achievement, but through lineage alone. This single moment set a precedent that would endure in China for thousands of years, a political model where bloodline determined the right to rule. But as with all dynasties born of triumph, the Xia would eventually face decay. In the 16th century BCE, during the reign of Yu's distant descendant, King Ji, the Xia dynasty reached its final days. Ji was depicted in accounts as a cruel and indulgent tyrant, a man who led military assaults not for defense or necessity, but for personal revenge and self-serving desires. His court descended into excess lavish feasts, drunken revelry, and violent whims. His immorality blinded him to the discontent festering across the land, but ancient China believed in a cosmic balance known as the mandate of heaven, the idea that heaven granted power to just rulers and stripped it away from the wicked. And under Ji, it seemed heaven itself recoiled. As China entered the Bronze Age, a new force emerged equipped with advanced bronze weaponry. Their rebellion rose like a storm. With swift and decisive power, they overthrew Ji and brought an end to the Xia dynasty. From the ashes of the old rose, a new ruling power, the Shang dynasty, was about to reshape China once again. The fall of Shang and rise of Zhou. Over time, the once powerful Shang dynasty decayed from within. At the center of its collapse stood Di Xin, the final Shang ruler, a man whose excesses carried the ruinous behavior of the Xia tyrant Jie. What began as personal indulgence soon twisted into a reign defined by cruelty and arrogance. Di Xin buried himself in luxuries, endless feasts, lavish orgies, and a court ruled by fear. Advisors who questioned him were tortured or silenced. Even his own family suffered. One tale claims he ordered his uncle's heart torn out as a warning to all. Beyond the palace walls, the kingdom was unraveling. Poverty deepened, disasters struck the land, and rebellions shook the edges of the empire. Many began saying the unthinkable, that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven. The challenge came from the Zhou, loyal vassals from the Wei Valley who could no longer tolerate Dixin's decay. In 1046 BCE, they marched to end Shang rule. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Muye. Though the Zhou lacked the Shang's wealth, they held something greater: the people's support. Slaves conscripted into Shang ranks defected to the Zhou, and even loyal soldiers hesitated to fight for a corrupt king. The battle was brutal, with tens of thousands of Zhou soldiers falling, but the Shang army collapsed entirely, losing hundreds of thousands. Defeated, Dixin retreated to his palace, surrounded himself with his treasures, and set the building ablaze, choosing death in flames over capture. With victory secured, the Zhou claimed not only the empire, but heaven's blessing. The mandate of heaven became a central pillar of Chinese political thought, but the Zhou had no idea how many challenges lay ahead. Meanwhile, the Zhou dynasty became China's longest-lasting dynasty, ruling from 1046 to 256 BCE. It was a time of sweeping transformation. Irrigation systems expanded farmland, canals connected distant regions, and horseback travel revolutionized communication and warfare. Silk production spread beyond China, astonishing distant traders. But the greatest leap came with iron. While much of the world lagged centuries behind, the Zhou learned to cast iron using advanced furnaces and clay molds. Iron weapons and tools boosted agriculture, warfare, and population growth, pushing China into a new technological age. Yet with rapid expansion came new instability. Ruling a massive empire was far more difficult than conquering one. However, the Zhou realm split into two eras. The first, the Western Zhou, relied on a feudal system. Kings granted land to local lords in exchange for loyalty. At first, it created stability. Over time, it bred ambition. Generations of lords gained wealth and military power until they no longer feared the king. Eventually, they revolted, raiding the Zhou capital of Haojing. Forced to flee east, the Zhou established a new capital in Luoyang. Though the dynasty survived in name, real power had slipped from the king's grasp. A new chapter of Chinese history was beginning. The Eastern Zhou period, beginning in 771 BCE, was marked by political fragmentation, but also an explosion of philosophy that reshaped China forever. Three great schools emerged: Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. At the center stood Confucius, born Kongchu in the state of Lu. Raised in poverty after his father's early death, he devoted himself to learning, studying literature, history, and music in a school for commoners. After marrying young and losing his mother soon after, he worked modest government jobs just to afford her burial. His wisdom slowly gained attention, eventually earning him the role of Minister of Criminal Affairs. Watching China's moral decay firsthand shaped his philosophy. Confucius believed people had natural goodness, but society needed structure to nurture it. He defined 5 essential relationships known as the 5 bonds: ruler to subject, husband to wife, father to son, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. He taught that respecting elders, honoring family, and fulfilling one's duties would heal a broken society. In his view, a virtuous family was the foundation of a virtuous nation. His ideas would be carried across centuries, influencing China and East Asia for millennia. The road to the warring states. Confucius saw China as a vast family, united not by borders but by shared moral duty. To him, rulers were like parents, meant to guide with virtue, not fear. When leaders acted with compassion, he believed the people would respond with loyalty and harmony. But while Confucius promoted benevolence, another philosophy rose in opposition. Legalists held a far darker view of human nature. They argued that people were inherently selfish and disorderly, and only strict laws with harsh punishments could maintain stability. Han Feizi, once a Confucian student, became the leading voice of this doctrine, insisting that idealism could never hold together a fracturing state. As turmoil spread across the late Zhou era, many rulers turned toward legalism's rigid effectiveness. A third philosophy emerged as a counterpoint to both. Taoism encouraged individuals to live in accordance with the natural flow of the universe rather than forcing order through moral codes or legal control. It taught balance, softness, and acceptance, symbolized by the yin-yang. Together, these three schools of Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism formed the intellectual core of Chinese civilization and defined what historians later called the 100 Schools of Thought. But while scholars debated, the Zhou dynasty was disintegrating. Former Zhou vassals, now powerful and ambitious, began declaring themselves kings. Unity shattered and China split into contending powers. Eventually, 7 major states stood at the center of an era defined by constant war: Qin, Han, Yan, Wei, Zhao, Chu, and Qi. Each wanted total dominance. It was within this environment of shifting alliances and relentless campaigns that a strategist named Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, a revolutionary guide that distilled warfare into principles of adaptability, deception, and psychological advantage. Among the 7 states, the Qin rose with unmatched discipline and military innovation. At their head was Ying Zheng, who would one day call himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. The Qin began their push toward unification by conquering the vulnerable Han state. Zhao, once a formidable rival, had been severely weakened decades earlier at the catastrophic Battle of Changping, where nearly 700,000 lives were lost between the Qin and Zhao armies. Zhao's survival now depended on its greatest general, Li Mu, whose strategies repeatedly thwarted Qin advances. Unable to defeat Li Mu in open battle, Ying Zheng turned to deception. Qin agents bribed and manipulated Zhao officials, convincing the king that Li Mu was plotting treason. Li Mu was removed from command and executed. Without him, Zhao collapsed. In 228 BCE, its capital Handan fell and the king was killed. With Zhao gone, Qin forces turned toward the state of Yan. Knowing they could not win militarily, Yan's crown prince Dan attempted a desperate solution: assassinate Ying Zheng. He enlisted Jing Ke, who posed as a defector carrying gifts of surrender, one of them a map concealing a poisoned dagger. When Jing Ke presented the map, he lunged at the king. Ying Zheng narrowly escaped, drawing his long ceremonial sword after a frantic struggle. Jing Ke was killed and the attempt failed. After the failed assassination, Ying Zheng moved swiftly. Qin armies captured the Yan capital Jicheng in 226 BCE. King Shi of Yan, hoping to delay destruction, executed his own son, the prince who planned the assassination. Then he sent Ying Zheng the head as appeasement. The effort only postponed the inevitable, and in 222 BCE, the Qin conquered the rest of Yan, erasing the state entirely. The fall of the warring states. The Han had been victorious. Under Emperor Gaozu, the empire at last began to breathe again. Order returned to shattered provinces, borders were secured against chaos, laws were softened and reformed, and the people, long exhausted by the suffocating brutality of the Qin, felt a cautious relief. Yet beneath this thin veneer of calm, the Middle Kingdom still trembled. Peace existed, but only on the surface. Beneath it, old threats quietly sharpened their blades. Although Gaozu had seized the Dragon Throne, the empire he inherited was anything but unbreakable. From the northern steppes came winds that carried dread. The Xiongnu, those relentless nomadic horsemen who had tormented the Qin before him, continued to thunder across the frontier with terrifying ease. They rode like shadows over the endless grasslands, their arrows whistling with deadly precision. Every raid, every incursion, was a reminder of how vulnerable the young Han remained. And enemy riders were not the only danger. Within the empire, the loyalty of many Han generals wavered uncertainly, like torches flickering in a cold wind. Some still nursed grudges from the Civil War, others nursed bold ambitions in private, and a few whispered doubts about whether the empire was worth their allegiance at all. Stability, Gaozu realized, was far more fragile than victory. Then came the humiliations. Blow after blow from the Xiongnu cavalry battered the Han armies, each defeat stripping away pride and exposing weakness. Finally, Gaozu faced a decision no emperor ever wishes to confront. Peace bought through tribute, not triumph, and so the Han chose appeasement. Instead of soldiers, they sent gifts. Instead of steel, they offered concessions. Each year, caravans wound their way north, laden with grain, wine, precious goods, symbols of enforced humility wrapped in silk. These offerings were meant to secure peace, but every tribute was also a quiet admission of a bitter truth. China was powerful, but not yet invincible. When Gaozu died in 195 BCE, a new struggle erupted over the Dragon Throne. a battle devoid of swords but infinitely more dangerous. It unfolded in whispers, alliances, and calculated smiles. Officially, Gaozu's second son, Emperor Hui, inherited the throne. Unofficially, real power had already shifted elsewhere. In the shadowed corridors of the palace, a single woman ruled with a grip as cold as iron, Empress Lu, Gaozu's widow and Hui's mother. To secure her dominance, she eliminated rivals with chilling efficiency, ordering the execution of several of Gaozu's other sons. But even these killings faded in comparison to her most infamous act, the one that froze the court in horror and carved her name into legend. Lady Qi, Gaozu's favorite consort, had also borne him children. Popularity made her dangerous, motherhood made her threatening, and beauty made her intolerable to Empress Lu. What happened next became one of the darkest episodes in Chinese court history. The Han historian Sima Qian recorded it with disturbing clarity. Empress Lu had Lady Qi's hands and feet cut off. Her eyes were gouged out, her ears burned, and a potion was forced down her throat that left her mute. Then, mutilated and unable to scream, she was thrown into a foul latrine and mockingly renamed the human swine. When Emperor Hui saw what had been done to his father's beloved mistress, something inside him broke. Horrified and powerless, he surrendered the affairs of state to his mother and retreated into a haze of drinking and pleasure. He died young, only 22, leaving behind an empire ruled not by emperors but by regents, clans, and opportunists. Amid rotation after rotation of fragile rulers, the Han somehow maintained a fragile peace. But in 141 BCE, everything changed. A new emperor ascended, Emperor Wu, a ruler whose reign would stretch an astonishing 57 years and reshape China's destiny. Yet, even as Emperor Wu began consolidating his power, the threat from the Xiongnu intensified once more. Tribute had bought time, but not loyalty. Raids grew bolder, riders more savage. By 133 BCE, China was at war again. During the conflict, the Han sent a handful of envoys westward. Their mission seemed simple: find allies who also feared the Xiongnu. But what they discovered was far beyond anyone's expectations. They returned with knowledge and vivid descriptions of civilizations far beyond China's horizon: kingdoms of India, bustling markets of Central Asia, wealthy cities of the Middle East. This intelligence became the blueprint for something monumental: the Silk Road. Stretching from China to the distant Mediterranean, this network of trade routes carried silk, jade, spices, ideas, technologies, and eventually religions. The Greeks called China Seers, the land of silk, giving the road its legendary name. For more than 1,500 years, the Silk Road would pulse like an artery, pumping culture, wealth, and innovation across continents. Buddhism would one day travel along it, though whether Emperor Wu ever knew the teachings existed remains a mystery. Even as trade blossomed, the war raged on. The Han achieved many victories against the Xiongnu, pushing deep into the frontier and expanding the empire south into the lands of modern Vietnam and Myanmar, but victory was expensive. Hundreds of thousands of Han soldiers died, treasury vaults drained faster than taxes could refill them, and peasants groaned under the weight of war levies. Now, China stood on the brink once again. In the year 9 AD, just as the Han staggered under the weight of war and famine, a rising statesman seized his moment. His name was Wang Mang, and he declared a new dynasty, the Xin. To the peasants, Wang Mang seemed like a savior, but to the aristocracy he was a nightmare. He seized aristocratic land and redistributed it to the poor, a move so bold that later historians nicknamed him China's socialist emperor. But good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Natural disasters battered the land, floods and famine tore through the countryside. Meanwhile, northern defenses crumbled as the Xin failed just as disastrously as their predecessors to repel the Xiongnu. China descended into chaos. Out of the devastation rose new powers and rebellion groups that electrified the countryside. Two in particular dominated. First is the Red Eyebrows, named for the red paint they smeared above their eyes to distinguish themselves in battle. Second is the Lulin rebels, small-band guerrillas who swelled into armies. Imperial troops attempted again and again to suppress these uprisings, but each campaign ended in disaster. In 23 AD, Wang Mang was killed in battle, his dynasty collapsing with him, yet even the rebels could not maintain order. The Red Eyebrows plundered villages, desecrated Han tombs, and soon alienated the very people they sought to liberate. They devolved into a violent, leaderless mob. In their desperation, they surrendered to a rising leader, Liu Xiu. Known to history as Emperor Guangwu, pardoned the Red Eyebrows and began his campaign of restoration. Over the next decade, he crushed rival warlords one by one until at last he alone ruled the realm, but the old capital, Chang'an, was burned, looted and broken. So Guangwu chose a new heart for the empire, Luoyang. With this shift, the next era of the Han began, the Eastern Han dynasty. Under Guangwu's guidance, hope slowly returned, taxes were lowered, peasants regained stability. Over 100 new academic institutions rose across the land, building an educated class that would guide China's future. Confucianism regained its place at the center of Chinese life. Young men who embodied its virtues were nominated as government officials, a system that would astonishingly survive for nearly 2 millennia. A golden age was dawning. The Eastern Han surged with energy and the economy boomed. The military strengthened, armed with crossbows for long-distance killing and iron axes and swords for brutal close combat dominance. The empire expanded its control over Korea and Vietnam. The Xiongnu inside Han territory rose up and were crushed. Yet as the empire grew stronger, its emperors grew weaker. The real power shifted into the hands of civil servants and court officials who appointed and removed emperors at will. Their greatest contribution, however, would redefine the world, the invention of paper. For the first time in Chinese history, ideas moved freely, cheaply, and widely, but progress did not prevent decline. A weakening central government increased taxes, neglected famine relief, and ignored the suffering of the common people. And from this suffering rose a storm. In 184 AD, a Taoist healer named Zhang Jue declared that the Han had lost the mandate of heaven. His followers, wearing yellow turbans, surged through China like wildfire, attacking government offices, raiding towns, and promising a new era of equality. Though the rebellion was ultimately crushed, the damage was done. The Han were broken fatally. To survive, the government empowered regional nobles again. These nobles quickly transformed into warlords, carving China into personal kingdoms. A new age of conflict began. Warlords fought, alliances were destroyed, and armies marched endlessly. Eventually, only 3 major states remained: Wei, Wu, and Shu Han. One by one they fell. First Shu Han, exhausted by war, then Wei, swallowed by the rise of the powerful Jin clan, and finally Wu in 280 AD. China was reunified under the Jin dynasty, but unity would not bring peace. Emperor Wu of Jin ascended the throne and swiftly abandoned governance for indulgence. He filled his harems with thousands of women and created a bizarre system for choosing knightly partners. He rode through the palace in a goat-drawn cart, sleeping with whichever concubine the goats happened to stop in front of. Women even scattered salt and bamboo outside their doors to lure the goats nearer. For 8 years, the emperor lived in this haze of pleasure. Marriage itself was banned until he finished selecting his concubines. Governance ceased. Corruption spreads. And when Emperor Wu died in 290, China plunged into one of its darkest civil wars, the War of the 8 Princes. Warlords invited nomadic tribes, especially the Xiongnu, into their conflicts. But these tribes soon turned against their hosts, conquering northern China and forcing the Jin court to flee south. China spiraled into centuries of fragmentation until, at last, in 581, a new dynasty arose with the promise of unity, the Sui dynasty. The Sui reunited China in 589 and restored Han Chinese rule over a fractured land. They also sought to culturally absorb the northern barbarians who had settled in China during the chaos. Confucianism and Buddhism flourished under Emperor Wen, who had been raised by a Buddhist nun, but threats loomed beyond China's borders, especially from the rising Turkic powers of the steppe. Then came Emperor Yang, Wen's son, and with him everything unraveled. Obsessed with glory, Emperor Yang poured the empire's strength into colossal building projects. Peasants died by the thousands rebuilding and expanding walls, roads, and palaces, but his greatest obsession was conquest. Yang launched 3 catastrophic invasions of Goguryeo in modern Korea. Each failed more disastrously than the last. In the final campaign, 90% of Sui soldiers died, while Goguryeo losses were minimal. The empire bled, the people starved, rebellion was everywhere, and the Sui dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own emperor's ambition. The rise of Li Yuan. China entered the final years of the Sui dynasty in chaos, famine tearing through the countryside, rebellions rising like wildfires, failed wars draining the treasury, and an emperor spiraling into suspicion and madness. In this collapsing world, two figures emerged who would reshape the fate of the empire: Li Yuan and his son Li Shimin, the unlikely architects of China's next great dynasty. Born in 566 CE, Li Yuan came of age in a fractured realm where borders shifted as quickly as loyalties. Nomadic invasions, ruthless court politics, and rulers who lived in constant fear made high status as dangerous as it was prestigious. His family was tied closely to the imperial house, but under Emperor Yang Guang, proximity to the dragon throne could be lethal. Yang Guang's tyranny grew with every passing year, and even the most loyal officials learned that a single misstep could cost them everything. While Li Yuan navigated the deadly currents of palace intrigue, his son Li Shimin forged his reputation on the battlefield. Still young, he showed a strategic brilliance that startled veteran commanders. He shattered Turkic forces again and again, even orchestrating one legendary deception. Using flags and drums to simulate a vast army, he bluffed the Turks into retreat without spilling a drop of blood. But even Shimin's victories could not hide the truth. The empire itself was rotting. The Sui dynasty was unraveling from the inside. Emperor Yang's catastrophic invasions of Goguryeo consumed resources, manpower, and morale, sparking uprisings across the empire. His paranoid executions of loyal generals sent waves of terror through the capital. What had once been a unified realm now trembled on the edge of collapse. Li Yuan saw the danger tightening around him. Remaining obedient to the emperor was no longer loyalty, it was suicide. Li Shimin, bold and clear-eyed, urged him to act. Doing nothing now meant the family's destruction. Finally, Li Yuan made his move. He quietly spread rumors of yet another Goguryeo invasion, stoking public outrage against Yang Guang's ruinous policies. Support swelled rapidly. He warned his family to escape before imperial assassins reached them. Meanwhile, rebel armies surged across the provinces and Turkic riders pushed deeper into the northern frontier. Li Yuan hesitated, unsure whether rebellion or retreat was the wiser path. Li Yuan's daughter Pingyang not only escaped the capital but rallied tens of thousands of rebels under her banner. With her forces merging into Li Yuan's, the family entered the rebellion together as military leaders. The assault on Chang'an was swift. Li Yuan's forces seized the capital and deposed the Sui heir. Far from the capital, Yang Guang was betrayed and killed by his own officials. With the Sui gone, Li Yuan emerged as the new power in China. In 618 CE, Li Yuan declared the Tang dynasty, becoming its first emperor. Li Shimin, the military genius behind many victories, was made prime minister. But new threats immediately surrounded the dynasty. Rival states in the east, Turkic pressure in the north, and a growing conflict within the imperial family itself. Li Shimin's rising fame alarmed his elder brother Li Jiancheng, the crown prince. Fear turned to hostility. Jiancheng and another brother, Li Yuanji, built a private army and plotted to eliminate Shimin. Though Shimin exposed some of their actions, Emperor Li Yuan, influenced by Jiancheng's allies in the palace, did little to stop the chaos. As Turkic forces approached Chang'an, Li Shimin confronted the Khagan personally. His fearless challenge to single combat unsettled the Turks, and a sudden storm further weakened their confidence. They withdrew, reinforcing Shimin's heroic reputation and worsening Jiancheng's resentment. Jiancheng then attempted to poison Shimin at a banquet. Shimin nearly died, and the emperor tried to calm the brothers by dividing the empire. But the rivalry had moved beyond compromise. In 626, another Turkic incursion gave Jiancheng and Yuanji their opportunity. They convinced the emperor to give Yuanji command of the army instead of Shimin. Desertions spread through Shimin's ranks. Realizing his life was again in danger, Shimin resolved to strike first. Shimin lured his brothers to the palace gate with a forged accusation. When they arrived, he ambushed them. Jiancheng was killed by Shimin's arrow. Yuanji was slain soon after by the loyal general Yuqi Jingde. The succession struggle ended in a single violent morning. Li Yuan, exhausted by the conflict, abdicated. Li Shimin took the throne as Emperor Taizong, one of China's greatest rulers. His first task was securing peace with the Turks, whom he wisely waited out as their own internal divisions worsened. When the Eastern Turkic Khaganate fell apart through internal cruelty and rebellion, Taizong intervened with precision. By 630, the Khaganate collapsed and the Turkic tribes recognized Taizong as their ruler, granting him the unprecedented title Heavenly Khan. Under Taizong, the Tang dynasty expanded, diversified, and rose to international prominence. Chang'an became the world's most cosmopolitan city. The forging of the Middle Kingdom, begun in Shang and unified under the Han, continued through Tang ambition, built by rebellion, strategy, and the extraordinary rise of Li Yuan and Li Shimin. The fall of the Tang. The Tang dynasty was once the brightest empire in Asia. Its cities held millions, its culture blended Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and its arts reached unparalleled heights. Poets, painters, and craftsmen defined an age of beauty, while Tang armies expanded influence from Korea to Vietnam and westward toward Central Asia. But beneath this brilliance, the first signs of decline began to form. When Emperor Xuanzong took power in 712, his early rule marked the height of Tang prosperity. Yet over time he grew detached, allowing officials to govern in his name. Into this vacuum rose Li Linfu, a shrewd and ruthless minister who gained control of the court after 736. Li Linfu eliminated rivals and implemented policies that ultimately weakened the empire. His most disastrous decision was appointing foreign-born generals as military governors, believing they would remain neutral in court politics. One such general was the powerful An Lushan, commander of 150,000 troops and a favorite of Xuanzong. When Li Linfu died in 753, An Lushan lost political protection. Surrounded by enemies, he turned to rebellion. In 755, An Lushan launched a massive revolt, capturing Luoyang and declaring a new dynasty, the Yan. His next target was Chang'an, the Tang capital. A small Tang force briefly halted his advance at Yongchu, but poor strategic decisions soon allowed the rebels to break through. The road to Chang'an opened. As rebel armies approached Chang'an, panic consumed the capital. Emperor Xuanzong fled towards Sichuan with his large entourage. The journey was disastrous, with supplies ran out, soldiers mutinied, and executions followed. Behind him, Chang'an fell to the rebels. Looting, slaughter, and destruction devastated the city. Upon reaching Sichuan in 756, Xuanzong abdicated in favor of his son, but the rebellion continued to rage. The new emperor reorganized the Tang forces and pushed back. Meanwhile, An Lushan deteriorated into paranoia and violence. In 757, he was killed by his own son, An Qingshu, who then inherited a collapsing rebellion. An Qingshu besieged Suiyang, where defenders resorted to cannibalism after supplies ran out. Though the Yan forces eventually took the city, they suffered enormous losses. This weakened the rebellion enough for the Tang to reclaim both capitals. By 763, the An Lushan rebellion was crushed, but the Tang emerged gravely weakened. The rebellion left up to 20% of the population dead. Farmland lay ruined, finances collapsed, and imperial authority fractured. During the 9th century, nomadic powers seized frontier lands while corrupt officials and bandit gangs spread across the empire. Amid this turmoil rose another challenge. In 875, Huang Chao, a former salt smuggler, launched a massive uprising fueled by famine, corruption, and social collapse. His forces seized Chang'an in 881, and he declared himself emperor of the Daqi dynasty. But his regime was unstable with famine. Administrative failures and disorder weakened his hold. Zhu Wen, a former rebel who defected to the Tang, led counterattacks with foreign allies. Huang Chao was defeated and killed in 884. His rebellion dealt the Tang its final, irreversible blow. In 850, an alchemist accidentally created gunpowder, a discovery that would eventually reshape the world. But for the Tang, it came too late. By the late 9th century, the state was fractured beyond repair. Warlords dominated the land, the military splintered, and central power evaporated. China drifted toward the era of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, a time of division and conflict that emerged from the ashes of the once mighty Tang. 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. The era that followed the collapse of Tang rule would become one of the most chaotic chapters in all of Chinese history. an age where loyalties shifted like desert sand and where the empire fractured into shards sharp enough to draw blood. Historians would later give this turbulent time a name, the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. But to those who lived through it, it felt less like a historical era and more like the world collapsing in slow motion. The chroniclers of the age often confessed that the period is notoriously difficult to follow, and how could it be otherwise? At times it seemed as though the very fabric of the realm trembled under the weight of betrayals, assassinations, and alliances that shattered before the ink on the agreements had dried. Generals were crowned one season and dead the next. Factions blossomed and withered like flowers in a frost. In many ways, it was a sign of the ancient warring states period, as though the ghosts of that age had returned to demand a second act. From this disjointed landscape rose 5 dynasties in the north, each striving to claim the mantle of legitimacy. Meanwhile, in the south and west, 10 independent kingdoms emerged, steady enough to endure for a time, but never powerful enough to shape the fate of the whole realm. Even in their relative stability, the southern kingdoms were little more than quiet footnotes compared to the violent ascents and cataclysmic falls of the 5 northern dynasties. However, the first man to seize the northern throne was Zhu Wen, a warlord who had once fought within the Great Huangchao Rebellion before switching sides and offering his services to the Tang. But Zhu Wen was a man with hunger far greater than loyalty, and once the Tang court began to rot, he saw his opportunity. In 904, he committed an act that shocked even a generation accustomed to brutality. He executed the Tang emperor and forced the dead ruler's 13-year-old son onto the throne as a puppet, nothing more than a trembling figurehead behind which Zhu Wen could maneuver. 3 years later, in 907, the mask came off entirely. Zhu Wen took over the throne, declaring himself emperor of the later Liang, the first of the 5 dynasties. But no crown in this age was worn without blood, and no throne was ever undisputed. Across the northern plains, warlords bristled at Zhu Wen's declaration. Among these rivals stood Li Qiong, a fierce general Zhu Wen had once attempted to assassinate. The memory of that betrayal burned deeply, and Li Qiong refused to acknowledge Zhu Wen's authority. Instead, he established the Kingdom of Jin, a small but potent spark that would eventually ignite a firestorm of rebellion. But rivals like Li Qiong were not Zhu Wen's only enemies. His true downfall would be carved from something far closer to home. Zhu Wen's cruelty grew so infamous that even hardened men whispered about him with unease. He began summoning his own sons' wives to the palace, forcing them into his bed. He preyed upon his officers' wives. He assaulted his own daughters-in-law. The palace was no longer a seat of government. It had become a den of predation. And inside the imperial household, Zhu Wen's sons watched their father spiral, watched him abuse, watched him divide them against one another, and watched him destroy the last fragile threads of familial loyalty. Finally, the breaking point came. The tyrant's third son, Zhu Yugui, murdered him inside the palace. One would expect a moment of liberation and of justice. But in this era, a throne gained through blood only invited more blood. Within a year, Yugui himself was murdered, slain by his younger brother Zhu Yuzhen, who seized the throne in yet another coup. For a brief decade, Zhu Yuzhen held together the fraying remnants of the dynasty. But storm clouds were gathering, and the Jin kingdom was growing bolder by the season. The confrontation that followed would redraw the map. Clashes started across contested territories, forts were razed, and armies were destroyed. By 923, the kingdom of Jin had grown powerful enough to challenge the Liang dynasty head-on. Their victory was decisive, and in the ashes of the fallen Liang rose the later Tang dynasty. They chose the name Tang deliberately, because it carried the golden age they hoped to resurrect. Its first emperor, Li Kunshu, son of Li Qiong, entered the stage with the promise of brilliance. For a moment it seemed China might finally unify under a new, stable banner, but brilliance does not guarantee wisdom. Li Kunshu hoarded wealth with his consort Empress Liu, lavishing themselves with riches while his soldiers, the very men who had fought to place him on the throne, went unpaid and unrecognized. In the spring of 926, Li Kunshu was cut down in a mutiny, leaving the throne vacant once more, and from the chaos another contender stepped forward. The third dynasty of the period emerged when Shi Tang, a seasoned general, seized power and declared the beginning of the later Jin. But Xu Jingtang lacked the military strength needed to hold China together, and desperation drove him north to make a deal with the nomadic Khitan, masters of the lands stretching across Mongolia and beyond. In exchange for their military support, Xu Jingtang agreed to surrender the 16 prefectures, strategic territories along the Great Wall that included modern Beijing and Tianjin. Even worse, he acknowledged the Khitan Emperor Yelu Deguang as his superior. This decision would haunt him and haunt China. Eventually, the later Jin rulers realized what they had done. They had traded sovereignty for survival, and they could not bear the humiliation. They attempted to distance themselves from Khitan rule. It was a fatal miscalculation. Enraged, Yelu Deguang marched south in fury, storming through the later Jin lands and annihilating resistance. The Shang prefecture was sacked, its population massacred. From this conquest emerged the Liao dynasty, and Yelu Deguang declared himself emperor of all China. But his rule was a crown of thorns. Hated by the people, rejected by the land, he met his end during a difficult journey north, dying far from the city he once claimed to rule. And once again the throne stood empty. Seizing the moment, a rebel named Liu Jiwan proclaimed the later Han dynasty, but fate showed him no mercy. Within a year, he was dead. His 17-year-old son, Liu Chengyu, inherited the throne, young, inexperienced, and tragically unprepared. A minister named Guo Wei, seeing the weakness at the heart of the new regime, took matters into his own hands. Within 3 years, he usurped the throne, destroying the later Han and establishing the later Zhou. Just like that, the fourth dynasty was gone. The fifth had begun, and the clock of history ticked toward reunification. Founded in 951, the later Zhou served as a vassal to the Khitan in the north. It endured only briefly, but its existence marked the final step before a long-awaited transformation. For in the chaos of the era, a new force was rising, a man whose destiny was to unite it. His name was Zhao Kuangyin, and with him the Song dynasty would be born. The Red Turbans and the Fall of the Yuan. The marriage of Genghis and Borte shaped the next decade of steppe life, producing 7 more children and strengthening his alliances. As his family grew, so did his influence. During these years, he remained closely bound to his childhood companion and sworn brother Jamukha. Together, they led united clans, sharing counsel, strategy, and even the same blanket. But ambition strained their bond. Rumors by Borte fed suspicion, and the two men drifted apart. Soldiers gradually abandoned Jamukha to follow Genghis, sensing in him a rising force. Soon, Genghis commanded the largest Mongol clan and was acclaimed by Khan. With this new authority, Genghis unleashed brutal psychological warfare across the steppe. His growing power only deepened Jamukha's bitterness, and conflict became inevitable. In 1187, the Battle of Dalan Baljut ended in a bloody victory for Jamukha, but his decision to boil 70 captured youths alive horrified even hardened Mongols. That single act destroyed his reputation, driving 10,000 of his own followers into Genghis's camp. Though defeated, Genghis emerged more determined. He rebuilt his army with precision and discipline, forging the machine that would soon terrorize Asia. When the Jin dynasty sought Mongol help against the Tatars, Genghis crushed the enemy with ease. Jamukha tried to ambush him afterward, but failed disastrously. After several defeats, he fled until his own followers betrayed him. Delivered to Genghis, Jamukha refused mercy and requested an honorable death, ending the long brotherhood-turned-rivalry. With Jamukha gone, Genghis ruled the steppe unchallenged. His authority stretched over more than 1 million people, and he turned his gaze south toward China. Between the Jin in the north and the Song in the south stood Western Xia. Genghis conquered Xia by 1209, then moved on the Jin, who foolishly executed his envoys. Enraged, he breached the Great Wall in 1211. After 2 brutal years, Zhongdu fell, and the Jin heartland collapsed. In 1227, as victory neared, Genghis died of fever. His empire was immense, built through slaughter, strategy, and staggering fertility. Yet the Mongol war machine continued under his sons. By the 1230s, the Mongols and the southern Song briefly allied to destroy the Jin in 1234. Once the Jin were gone, the Mongols turned on the Song themselves. Early campaigns stalled, but in 1251, Mongke Khan revived the offensive and expanded Mongol power across Asia. He placed his brother Kublai in command of the southern front. Kublai studied the Song's watery terrain and radically transformed the Mongol military by building a navy, something no Mongol ruler had attempted. In 1279, after relentless sieges and naval warfare, the southern Song fell. China was conquered. For the first time, the Middle Kingdom was ruled by a foreigner, Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty. The Red Turbans marched like a rising storm, an army formed by hardship, hunger, and a burning desire to reclaim a land long overshadowed by foreign rule. Their leader, Zhu Yuanzhang, had once wandered the countryside as a destitute Buddhist monk, begging for food at monastery gates and witnessing firsthand the misery the Mongol-led Yuan government had allowed to fester. Those years had carved into him a kind of unshakable resolve, as though every famine he endured and every temple he swept had prepared him for one purpose: to overthrow an empire. Under Zhu's command, the Red Turbans refined their guerrilla tactics into disciplined warfare. They studied the Mongols' weaknesses, capitalized on their fading grip over the south, and pushed with frightening efficiency until in 1368, the seemingly invincible Mongol Empire was forced to abandon the Dragon Throne. The last Yuan emperor fled into the northern steppes, leaving behind an empire fractured by corruption, plague, and exhaustion. Yet even in defeat, the Yuan left behind a legacy that could not be erased. For although they ruled China for less than a century, they had transformed it in ways no dynasty before them had dared. Under the Mongols, China's doors had swung open to the west. Caravans moved more freely across the Silk Road, trade surged, ideas, technologies, and travelers crossed borders with unprecedented ease. The empire itself expanded, stretching its reach with a unity enforced through sheer Mongol precision and overwhelming military force. And so, despite the Yuan's collapse, names like Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan remained permanently etched into China's historical consciousness. Towering figures whose origins lay outside the Han world, yet whose influence ran deep into the marrow of Chinese civilization. But what would rise from the ashes of the Yuan would alter China even more profoundly. In the turbulent year of 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang stepped into the Forbidden City and proclaimed himself emperor. The age of the Ming dynasty had begun, a dynasty that would stand as one of the most formidable in Chinese and world history. The new emperor adopted the regnal name Hongwu, meaning vast military might, and he would live up to it. Determined never to let foreign rule or internal decay threaten China again, Hongwu constructed a standing army of over 1 million soldiers, a force unmatched by any European kingdom of the era. It wasn't merely an army, it was a physical declaration that China would no longer bend to invaders. Hongwu declared Nanjing the capital, turning it into a vibrant center of Han revivalism. For the first time in a century, traditional Han customs resurged with fierce pride. Neo-Confucianism, dismissed and belittled under the Mongols, returned as the intellectual backbone of the empire. Scholars flooded back into political life, merchants felt secure again, and artists found themselves in one of the most fertile creative periods China had ever experienced. It was during this cultural renaissance that the epic novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms was written, reviving tales of the Han dynasty's collapse and capturing the imaginations of millions for centuries to come. To rebuild a strong and loyal government, Hongwu revived the Confucian civil service exams, insisting that bureaucrats earn their status through study and merit rather than privilege. Meanwhile, Mongol clothing, Mongol names, and Mongol customs were banned. The message that China belonged to the Chinese again was clear, but Hongwu's reforms extended far beyond symbolism. Having survived famines and disaster as a peasant, he understood better than any ruler before him how fragile the life of a farmer could be. Determined to prevent the suffering he had endured, he ordered massive irrigation networks, constructed new dikes, restored ancient flood systems, and encouraged agricultural innovation. As water flowed more predictably and fields expanded, the population boomed. Grain surged through trade routes, markets thrived. China seemed reborn, and Hongwu was not done. Realizing that warfare was evolving, he ordered that 10% of his troops be trained as gunners, accelerating China's mastery of early gunpowder weapons. Cannons, primitive firearms, and new siege technologies solidified the Ming military as one of the most advanced on Earth, capable of holding back Mongol remnants in the north and deterring threats from beyond its borders. Meanwhile, power had lifted Hongwu to unimaginable heights, but it had also warped him inch by inch. His childhood trauma, mixed with the hunger, the death, and the chaos, left deep scars. Scars that twisted into suspicion, then paranoia, eventually terror. To maintain absolute control, Hongwu drafted a new legal code unlike anything China had seen. It was as detailed as it was merciless. Executions became public theater, but tortures such as lingqi, the harrowing death by 1,000 cuts, in which a victim's flesh was sliced away piece by piece. Another punishment, flaying, removed the skin entirely. These horrors were meant not just to punish dissent, but to obliterate the very idea of rebellion. Massacres were carried out against those he believed disloyal. Whole families vanished. Court officials trembled at every summons, knowing that a single accusation could end in catastrophe. Yet Hongwu's fears were not entirely imagined. The Mongols still lurked in the north, raiding and testing China's defenses. And so Hongwu instilled in his successors a lasting obsession: strengthen China's borders at any cost. This obsession would echo through the next generations, shaping one of China's greatest engineering feats. During the reign of the Hongzhi Emperor in 1487 to 1505, Hongwu's vision hardened into stone. The Ming poured enormous resources into rebuilding, fortifying, and extending China's northern defenses. The result was the most iconic version of the Great Wall, the same stone battlements, watchtowers, and winding ridges recognizable today. This wall was not simply a barrier. It was a statement that promised that China would never again be conquered by foreign horsemen sweeping down from the steppes. But even a wall could not protect the dynasty from what grew from within. For in every decree Hongwu issued, in every Confucian scholar restored to office, in every canal dredged, field irrigated, or fortress reinforced, there was something ancient. Something that had first taken shape in the shadowed courts of the Shang had been refined by the Zhou and their mandate of heaven. Tested by the warring states, hardened by Qin conquest, and immortalized through the enduring legacy of the Han. The Middle Kingdom had always been more than a dynasty. It was an idea and a belief that China was a civilization destined to endure. Even as steppe warriors surged over its borders, even as dynasties rose and crumbled like dust on a battlefield, even as emperors from foreign bloodlines claimed the Dragon Throne. And so, when the Yuan collapsed and Hongwu marched through the gates of the Forbidden City, it was not merely the end of Mongol rule. Moreover, the Ming dynasty did not simply replace the Yuan. It resurrected an identity older than Genghis, older than Kublai, older even than Confucius. An identity that had been shaped over millennia by the struggles of early kings, the philosophies of sages, and the unbroken march from Shang to Zhou to Han. Now, under Hongwu, that ancient identity surged back to the surface like a river returning to its course, but history would prove that walls alone could not protect this legacy. For even as the Ming basked in its renewal, shadows whispered beyond the horizon with ambitions stirring in the north, schemers rising within the court, and distant lands soon to be reached by a fleet of treasure ships that would challenge the very boundaries of the known world. The Middle Kingdom had reclaimed its throne, but its trials were far from over. And the story of how China, forged in the fires of its earliest dynasties, endured the storms of empires yet to come, was only beginning.